and there were continuing efforts to try and shoot these things down. That's better. P-80 jet fighter was based in California, sent up. But in fact, what I have learnt is that following the recovery, or following the Roswell incident, according to my information provided by Andy Kistner, a shooting star landed on 15th of July in New Mexico on a remote stretch of Highway 380, 25 miles southwest of the Corona crash site at Carrizozo. I'd never heard of Carrizozo before. Anyone here heard of Carrizozo? Bravo. Close to the northeast corner of the White Sands missile range. Its mission, to provide air cover for the recovery operation in case another disk attempted to impede elements of the T-Force. I'm told by Kistner that a technical intelligence team known as a T-Force was dispatched to recover the disks in the New Mexico desert, and this plane was to provide air cover. On the 18th of July, the plane took off from this remote strip on the road near a garage and immediately crashed into the garage, killing at least one other person and, of course, the pilot. This event was only mentioned in a few local newspapers. Next, please. Next. Thank you. That was the P-80 shooting star. It might just as well have been a pea shooter. This is a lady, Rosine Cordes, who was at Roswell at the time of the Roswell incident. Her father owned the Hub Corn Ranch at the time. Her name now is Rosine Cordes. She was married to an Air Force guy who became Deputy Chief of Staff of Intelligence later on at Strategic Air Command. And she told me that on the 4th or 5th of July, or thereabouts, she went to collect some ice in Roswell for a picnic. But she found out, first of all, she couldn't get any from one of the dairies was closed. She went to the train station for this picnic, and she said, I went all over town looking for ice for the beer. There was none because Glenn, that is, as you know, the gentleman who came out with a great deal of testimony about the nurse and his own, Glenn Dennis, his own participation as mortician contracted to the Roswell Army Airfield at the time. So this confirms his statement that the Army the Army Air Forces were keen on getting ice. And actually they told her that specifically, he and the Air Force had been in to get all this material. Next, please. Werner von Braun is said to have been one of those taken to one of the crash sites. I don't know which one in particular. This is information that's been made available to me by Clark McClellan, a former NASA worker. It's interesting, there is some confirmation from Dr. Robert Sarbacker, who Mr. Dolan was talking about earlier on, that Werner von Braun would indeed have been asked to be involved in the study of the materials. Next, please. Now, I don't think many of you are familiar with the evidence supplied by a Polish biophysicist. This is a guy given the name Dr. Chris. In 1974, together with a small team of European scientists from Poland, obviously, France and Italy, were given by NASA, they were on contract to NASA, to examine some strange materials that had been recovered allegedly from an Iron Curtain country. They were the biophysicists were completely baffled by these samples. The metal, for example, had a melting point of above 2,000 degrees Celsius. There were odd materials. But that wasn't the end of it. A few years later, in 1977, in April 1977, the same team was invited to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Pasadena, California, where the director of this team, the same team that had been given these materials, was retiring. And during the evening's celebrations, the director offered to show them something interesting, the team. So he took them down 3 levels below at the JPL in Pasadena, April 1977, took them into a vault, a sealed vault, and showed them not only the remains of the materials that they had studied 3 years previously, but the skeletal remains of an alien. Here, you can see a skull here, and a hip bone. Now, this guy, Dr. Chris, said that there was no question, this wasn't the skeletal structure of a chimpanzee or a baby. It was genuinely inexplicable in terms of his expertise. And the exhibits, they were in sort of plexiglass material. There was a label that said, "From the first and second incidents in New Mexico." And so they said, "Well, whereabouts in New Mexico?" "Sorry, we don't do specifics. That's the only information you're going to get. That's top secret." But at least they were shown these materials. And Dr. Chris learned some very, very interesting things. He said there had been at least 2 incidents, and there had been 1 survivor. We've heard that before. Their blood was similar but not identical to ours in that it showed a totally different reaction toward oxygen. Nitrogen was no good for them, apparently, so they assumed that inside their ship they must breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen. Next, please. Now, I had a friendly argument with Bud Hopkins earlier this year when I saw him in April about Colonel Philip J. Corso. He said, "Tim, this guy says he was in the National Security Council. He was not. It's been proven." Well, unfortunately, Corso didn't have much of a hand in writing the day after Roswell, so there are lots of mistakes in the book. Sure, he was not on the National Security Council per se. He was on the National Security Council staff. But his military records, and they are here, prove that he was actually serving on the National Security Council's Operations Coordination Board, often known later as the Special Group, or the 5412 Group. Now, this was the unit that approved and evaluated the most sensitive covert operations mounted by the United States government. So Corso was very definitely involved in a sensitive position in the National Security Council staff, and there are the records to prove it. This is just part of a top-secret United States Air Force Europe report, which relates to a conversation by the American U.S. Air Force's Europe intelligence specialists with their Swedish counterparts. And it makes for some interesting reading. It talks about, I wish I could read it from here, but I hope you can. The second paragraph in particular, I think, is quite interesting. That these phenomena are obviously the result of a high technical skill which cannot be credited to any presently known culture on Earth. Next, please. This is General Vandenberg. Now, many of you may be aware of the top-secret estimate of the situation provided by, or mentioned, alluded to by Captain Ed Ruppelt, who headed Project Blue Book in the 1950s. So the first head of Project Blue Book. And he said that in 1948 there was an evaluation of the situation, which concluded that the unexplained UFOs were extraterrestrial in origin. And this was shown to General Vandenberg at the time, and he later on, in 1950, in fact, ordered that document and other copies to be burnt. And let's just have a look. I found the actual order to